I think, one of the ways to get at what we're talking about here is like I don't have a pen in my hand right now. I don't know if you have a pen, but this doesn't look at least at the surface like a literate event, but this is a highly, highly literate conversation. I mean, we're dropping names about certain authors, we're talking about literate tradition, but it's like the syntax and the grammar, the way that we're thinking, we're making sort of speculative, hypothetical thoughts, and I'm like trying to like imagine a somewhat unknown listener who I'm not really sharing a background with. Like in some sense, I'm talking to you, but I'm also aware that this is recorded. So I'm trying to like speak to people who I know are not here in this context. That's very different than the oral mind. I mean, the oral mind is a particular speaker to a particular person at a particular occasion with some exigency that's calling for address. That's very different than texts that just kind of wander around. And they introduce, again, as you mentioned, this notion of knowledge just abstractly out there, or of what information is in the abstract and how it would be consumed in a different context by a different person with a different set of assumptions. Dealing with something like ambiguity of the possible message because of different audiences that I know are going to hear it. That's again a sensibility I think would just be unheard of for
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
wholly oral mind or a wholly oral situation.
Hello. Thank you for tuning in to Circling into Dialogos and my conversation with Corey Anton. More about my conversation with Corey, which was awesome, in a moment. But first, some announcements. So if you are interested in diving into what we discuss on this channel in a participatory manner with other people, please visit the Circling Institute website. We have drop-in events, we have weekend events, we have year-long programs, all kinds of ways to get involved in circling and dialogos. And if you're interested in really enacting and living and not just thinking about the ideas, but embodying them, check that out. Also, if you are interested in working with me one-on-one, just go ahead and email me at guysengstock@gmail.com and let me know that you're interested, and I will get back with you and we'll schedule an exploratory session and talk about it. All right. So this conversation with Corey, it's been a while since I've talked with Corey. I've had a number of conversations with him in the past and have always enjoyed him deeply. In fact, he was one of the early YouTubers in discussing kind of philosophical topics and all kinds of things. He's a professor, PhD. He's written a bunch of books about communication, existentialism, philosophy, all those kinds of things. And so I wanted to have a conversation with him, specifically talking about the possible impact of literacy on relationship. And some of you know I'm in the middle of writing a book about circling, and one of the stories I'm telling through that book is how we kind of got here in what we call the loneliness epidemic. And so I'm exploring with Corey, who is Corey was the first guy to introduce me to the work of Walter Ong, who did a lot of work in oral cultures and the transformation that literacy had on virtually everything human. And so exploring this impact on relationship when alphabetic writing affords the uncollapse of the knower from the known for the first time. And what that possibly did or set up or afforded in terms of relationship. What was relationship like before literacy? When two people conversed, what did that mean? And so This conversation, we explore all those things and many, many other things. It's a fascinating conversation, and I look forward to having him back to discuss further. All right, no further ado, enjoy. What'd you put up your book again?
Okay.
I didn't even know you had a.
Yeah, I got a new book out right now. It's called AI Candy, and it's subtitled A Museum of Imaginary Robots and Other Digital Delights. And it's got 4 sections in it. So it has a section of robots, it's got a section of robots making art, and it's got a section of imaginary animals, and it's sort of like a modern bestiary. It also has a section that has basically like kind of artwork things that are abstract or surrealist imagery. None of them are, or trademarky or copyrighty. I'm not using brand name things. There's no McDonald's, there's no Mickey Mouse. They're all sort of unique, weird imagery. I regularly teach this graduate class in the winter called Emerging Communication Technologies. And just last year, ChatGPT hit the scene in late December. And because I do this grad class, I'm trying to keep apprised of all this stuff. And so I was an early adopter, and I started to play with ChatGPT like within 5 days of its release. And then I discovered the site called Hugging Face. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Hugging Face is really quite an amazing AI developer portal. When I first started, kind of fooling around with stuff there was around 700 AI systems, and now they're almost 7,000. And a good number of them are defunct, but they do about everything. It does text to image. It'll do animation. It'll do voice cloning. There's a lot of different things that are going on there.
God, what a trip. Especially being in the position that you are of teaching about all this stuff and the communication, and so you have your eye specifically on that horizon.
I mean, a lot of university wide curriculum, discussions about how to integrate AI into the classroom. What's the role of AI? Like, what should be the policy at the university? There's a lot of different things that are going on. That's sort of my world has become increasingly trying to just follow what's happening in the AI scene.
I bet. What do you think about? People have all kinds of different thoughts, obviously, about AI and the bigger impact and what it means and what is it exactly, right? What are we looking at when we're looking at AI and where it's going? And what's your sense of? It's a big question, but what's your sense of this just the horizon of AI?
Well, that's a big question. I guess what I would say, the most recent talk that I gave was at a philosophy colloquium about a month ago. And the title of my talk was Ambivalence and Ambiguity. And I guess that's what I would say, that I think what we're going to see over the next, say, 5-10 years is a great amount of ambivalence because there's so much ambiguity. You're probably going to see like a whole range of benefits and losses, and we're not going to know really how to feel about all this. So, it's going to be mass joblessness. You're going to see rise of people, in dating relations, as it were, with virtual bots. You're going to have, forms of alienation and estrangement and kinds of meaninglessness. But on the other hand, the promise for developing countries to, reliable desalination of ocean water and, curing various diseases. Like if people follow any of this stuff on Google AlphaFold, I don't know, Google does a lot of hype and they make a lot of claims, and then we're not sure exactly how true those claims are. But, I would tell people to go look at the video called Google Strikes Back. In that video, and it's probably not even 4 months old, but they claim, this is the actual claim in the video, is that within a few weeks, they achieved 400 million years worth of work, and they can accurately predict the folding of some 200 plus million proteins, basically all known proteins. Now, is that true? I don't know. I think there's some people saying, they were exaggerating, other people saying, at the very least, it's an amazing, amazing feat. What it will
Yeah.
mean for, healthcare, for disease prevention, anti-aging is probably absolutely revolutionary.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Totally. Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's so interesting to think about this. So interesting to think about this. Yeah.
I mean, the classroom's really changed. I routinely do, pretty difficult readings, and I want students to study and reread and this kind of stuff. And now I don't know if they're rereading so much as they'll kind of skim through it and then they'll try to figure out what they can ask some AI to, they can load in a whole paragraph. They can load in, various parts of a text and get a more digestible version, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of like, I mean, as you're talking about on the positive end, like you're right. I've listened to a bunch of stuff about all of the different biological medical advances that are like pretty much predictable at this point if they just keep going on this trajectory. I mean, cancer and, medicines that are perfectly designed for your genome and all of this kind of stuff is just going to be crazy science fiction stuff like in 10 years, in some ways.
Yeah.
And at the same time, that very thing that you're talking about of like, in that kind of Heideggerian sense of that, that way that technology kind of removes all friction and makes things immediately available. And you don't kind of have to go through something like a text and struggle with the text, for example, right? Because there's not just the information you get from like reading a text, but there's the struggle. There's the participation in the friction and the distance of what you're doing and all of that stuff that I think is, at least at the end of the day, I think it's the thing I value about reading more than I value the information that I've attained, for sure.
I agree. I think that's very good call, Guy. I mean, this is Sartre's notion of coefficients of adversity, right? Those are one of the ways that we grow. I mean, our bodies grow by facing resistances, overcoming obstacles and challenges. And without those conditions of resistance, the growth potential of the body just atrophies. And so, yeah, it's sort of scary. Like you can imagine, something like this world of Wall-E where people are just going to be conveyor belted around. I don't know. It's pretty scary. It's a mix. I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. I think the truth is it's going to be a massive mix, and it's going to be a blessing and a curse. And it could be the end of times. It could be this kind of I don't know if it's going to be some glory age or something like this sort of, techno utopian. That's probably wrong. It's going to be a mix.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't think it's necessarily going to be the end, although it probably, this Q star stuff. Oh God. I mean, some of this, like if you could have some AI that were so smart that it would make like if it merged with quantum computers and this kind of stuff. And, within 5 years, all of a sudden some person could potentially end encryption. I don't know what that would mean. I mean, there are weird things, not just, biological weaponry or somebody getting access to, nuclear codes and that kind of stuff. Again, sort of doomsday, but just real social disruption. I think the other thing I want to say, and again, there's a whole bunch, I mean, we could talk like forever on this, but I think one of the ways to get at it is to talk about when I've been talking about the book, I've been doing a lot of promo of the book and this kind of stuff. But I would call it lateral disruption. So like I was really free to create all these weird and goofy images because I don't see myself as a graphic artist. I basically write, academic books. And so in that sense, I'm very reluctant, and I have been very reluctant to have ChatGPT or any other generative AI writing system do my writing for me. I would feel like that's, counter to who I've grown myself into as a specialist, someone who writes his own stuff. But because I don't see myself as an artist, I felt free to dabble in this. And so I would say each person has like different aspects of themselves that are more or less cultivated. So somebody might not think of themselves as a musician, they might not think of themselves as an artist, but they think of themselves as a writer. Or somebody might think of themselves as a painter, but not an author. Or somebody might think of themselves as a musician, but not a poet. Anything that you don't think of yourself as really that, I think you're more inclined to feel free to kind of dabble in these AI systems. So there's going to be a lot of lateral disruption that happens as people who are fairly accomplished in some areas pursue this lateral expansion of themselves or extension of themselves through these various kinds of AI systems. And I think that the easy thing that's also very confusing is that people imagine this AI stuff is going to happen out there in the world. Like the concern is like, what's going to happen to the world and society? And those are legitimate concerns. But I think what's more interesting is how people who are using these technologies are transforming themselves as they're using.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing.
Yeah.
And that's actually one of the reasons why I reached out with you is to talk through a little bit of this because actually you were the first one that actually introduced me to Walter Ong and his work and a lot of thinking about orality in pre-literate writing and all those kinds of things. Which I just remember when I first was listening to your videos, like it just to think about what to try to put yourself into like an observer, right, of someone who has no knowledge nor no horizon of language being written or stored in any kind of way, right, is just it's one of those, kind of seeing the Ecker cube switch or something like that, like right in front of your eyes. It's so dramatically profound. Yeah. And I have a feeling, just to kind of catch you up a little bit. So if you remember, I started something called Circling a number of years ago. It basically emerged in the late 90s that I've been a part of. And it's essentially taking the basic I thou unit of relation and making its various components in some sense a yoga, right? Like asanas of listening, such that people can kind of practice this kind of sense of intimacy essentially. And there's nothing that I know of that takes that and focuses exclusively on that. And it spread really, really fast. I would say in spite of the personalities involved. It wasn't like we were a bunch of fucking marketers or anything like that. It just grassroots, in some sense spread. And for the longest time, I was trying to figure that out from kind of within what Circling did and all this kind of stuff. And it took me a while to kind of wiggle free of that and start to realize that this all started right at the dawn of the internet. And that I think something really important happened. This is as far as my thinking has kind of gone with this, but I think something really important happened. And I think the advent of the answering machine was the very beginnings of this, right? Of where if you basically had to have that two-way exchange of communication, that back and forth, before the answering machine, you at least had to talk on the phone, right? So in some way, now you had the printing press and you could receive information, right? But this two-way exchange connection was always coupled, as far as I can tell, with relation, or mostly anyways. Answer machine was this first time where you could kind of like leave messages back and forth, right, in some way. But then it became texting and email and then social media. And then now we have identities out there that are doing things right now that like we don't even have to be there for, right, in some sense. And so this uncoupling from connection, let's say, from relation is, I think essentially Circling in some way that we weren't understanding at the time was a response, right, to that sense. And of course, if we think about this kind of awkward thing called like making noises with our faces and pointing them at each other, this awkward thing, right, is filled with so much ambiguity, also normativity, tons of normativity. But if you think about all the things that could happen when you and I talk, Like you could say something to me that I misunderstand that hurts me so badly I need therapy for 10 years, right? It's like this range of people are terrifying, right? Human relationships have always been terrifying.
Yeah.
So if we eliminate the need for them and we can, I think what's just happened is like our nervous system will just make the easiest choice, just like your students are making with, right? In some sense, you reiterate that, and then you end up with some of the stats that we have now, which is 80% of people report their lives feel like being meaningless. 50% of people report having no close friends.
Yeah.
Like the amount of time spent with family, right, and friendships is like reduced by like 60%.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, the stats are astronomical. And what's interesting about this is like even this kind of weird Orwellian thing that they have going on in London, where they have the minister, they have a minister of loneliness, right?
It was a Cold Fusion just did a video on loneliness, right?
Yeah. And it's a strange because it's like I think it's a different, I think it's its own breed of loneliness. Like, I think it's a different kind of loneliness because you normally, when you think about loneliness, you think about like, I feel lonely. And that in some cases lets me know, should I need to be more around people? And in some sense, it's a pain that motivates one to go be around people. But this seems to be a kind of loneliness that the more that you experience it, the more that you actually are less inclined to be around people. The more you're drawn into more isolation. So it's got this kind of reverse thing about it. And so, and of course, all of this is within the last 20 years, right? So like, we don't know anything about it, right? But so when you look at all of this, in some sense, I've like the book that I'm writing is going to be the story of circling, but it's really going to be the arc of this story. But then I've been thinking about like, well, if you're really going to tell the history of this, which I think is basically Heidegger's notion of technology, right? I think it's like that's a big, everything from the forgetfulness of being and all of that Heideggerian kind of history stuff, I think is in synergy with this. But you'd have to say, it seems to me that there's been these further other uncollapsings in the structure of communication. And it's like, if I go all the way back and I think about, let's say, a holy oral culture, right? Which here I am, I'm in a smaller pack of people, under 150 people, let's say, where everyone I know, right, I've known my whole life, and everyone that they've known their whole life, right? The influx of somebody outside of my particular pack, right, is probably a radical rarity and anomaly. And like there's no where the sense of knowledge and the knower are completely fused, right? There's no knowledge, right, without a knower. And then I think about all of this, trying to put myself inside of this. It's like, think about like on some level, like we're having to carry a certain kind of mythic history, like these layers and layers of understanding that can't be stored anywhere. At best, pictures, which of course are not anything like alphabetic writing. And I'm trying to get this original sense of like, what must a conversation been like? Like what was relationships, right? What was it closer? Were they more intimate? And what way were they intimate? But I get this sense of this unquestioned, like some kind of unquestioned, of course, because they didn't have the perspective of that none of this was stored. So this is just, they're embedded in it. But I would imagine relationships had this significance to it that was implicitly so much denser in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't disagree with any of that. I mean, I think that to me just squares off pretty well. Uh, the language was probably mostly transparent, and it was like an envelope of meaning that, as you say, the relationship values were dominantly sort of occupying, but no notion, of the language as an abstract system that stood independently of people. I mean, linguistics is actually quite a late development in scholarly, discovery. I mean, you get something like that, you get some forms of semiotic work in the ancient Stoics and whatnot. But I think, modern linguistics, study of phonology, trying to study linguistics like rigorously as a science. Again, it's very modern. And I think, the Greeks, they said anyone who didn't speak Greek was a barbarian because they heard just they heard a bunch of sounds. And, they didn't hear meaningful words as we do. I think some of it is really difficult to, as you say, I mean, I think my guess is most people have thought very little about how much their consciousness has been radically remade in the image of literacy and the phonetic and the alphabetic word, and how much that sensibility of just being literate is very different. I mean, it changes your relationship to your own thinking. Like, I think anyone who uses a language at all, they give reasons, they think, but to become literate is to learn to reason about your reasoning. It's to have formal rules for logic. You get a growth of a massive amount of meta language. I mean, I think that was one of the real contributions of David Olson's work, is to talk about the rise of meta language. So I think all languages have to have some distinction between said and meant. That is, they have to be able to refer to the fact that they're talking. Now, again, you could ask, for how long were people talking before they had a word for what they were doing? Were they just, engaged in meaning, and then later there's like this meta language of called, the word like language that somehow is a system that's independent of the meanings that are conveyed. But yeah, there's so many words that are obviously meta language, a word like documentation, or a word like library, or a word like alphabet, but even subtler words, like reason or evidence, or um, a word like hint, or a word like paraphrase. The paraphrase verbatim distinction, I think, is one of the legacies that was clearly documented by people like Milman Berry, who they tried to show that, the oral mind, it has some notion of the same expression, but it doesn't have a notion of a verbatim recounting. So like these singers of oral tales, they do these oral histories and have these very elaborate mnemonic devices for recalling great amounts of information. And they certainly do have incredible memories. But when they took tape recorders over to some of these places where the oral bards were and they recorded them, they'd find slight little variations here and there that, for the speaker, who the words are largely transparent and the meaning is coming through, they're, like I said, the same thing. But the literate sensibility is like, no, you said a different expression. Again, we're gonna bust out with some meta language to differentiate out what was said, strictly speaking, from what was meant. And to the people who are indigenous oral, sharers of that tongue, it's, one of the great examples that Olson gives is like children, pre-literate children, they attend to the meaning of the words rather than the words. And one of his examples is, he says, when he's talking about, not only are children sort of transfixed by the stories when they hear a storyteller tell a story and they're not really attending to the words, but he was given this very specific example. He says he'd walk up to, again, very young children, like age 3 or so, and say, give me an example of a tiny word and then a really long word. And he'd say, how about caterpillar? And the kids would go, oh, caterpillar. No, caterpillars, that's a little tiny thing. And then he'd say, how about train? And they would go, oh, no, train. Train's a really big word. And that is, they would think about the object that's being meant by the word, not the properties of that word itself.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and this whole thing about being able to offload, like this sense of, I don't really think it makes sense on some level to like look at, I don't think of words storing, like storing things, but it kind of, you can kind of think about it like that, like where it's like to be able to offload and to not have to hold up in memory,
Yeah.
right? This whole thing.
It tolerates novelty as the fear for forgetfulness sorts of, it releases that burden of the fear for forgetfulness, and then you get a rise in novel expressions and experimentation. To think novel thoughts and unexpressed thoughts, to not just traffic in cliche, was to risk forgetfulness of lessons learned. And so there really is a direct sense in which the explosion of information and creative thought does run hand in hand with forms of literacy, documentation.
Totally. Yeah. So it's like, so I would imagine in some sense, kind of, this idea of people kind of sitting around having like long form meandering conversations, right? In some sense, like, is probably pretty unlikely.
Yes.
In fact, those verbal conversations like are built on literacy.
That's right. That's right. I think there's probably a general, people are just a little bit more laconic. That is, they're in the relation. They don't feel the burden to explicitly spell everything out in nitty gritty detail and all this kind of stuff. I think, one of the ways to get at what we're talking about here is like I don't have a pen in my hand right now. I don't know if you have a pen, but doesn't look at least at the surface like a literate event, but this is a highly, highly literate conversation. I mean, we're dropping names about certain authors, we're talking about literate tradition, but it's like the syntax and the grammar, the way that we're thinking, we're making sort of speculative, hypothetical thoughts, and I'm like trying to like imagine a somewhat unknown listener who I'm not really sharing a background with. Like in some sense, I'm talking to you, but I'm also aware that this is recorded. So I'm trying to like speak to people who I know are not here in this context. That's very different than the oral mind. I mean, the oral mind is a particular speaker to a particular person at a particular occasion with some exigency that's calling for address. That's very different than texts that just kind of wander around. And they introduce, again, as you mentioned, this notion of knowledge just abstractly out there, or of, what information is in the abstract and how it would be consumed in a different context by a different person with a different set of assumptions. Dealing with something like ambiguity of the possible message because of different audiences that I know are going to hear it. That's, again, a sensibility I think would just be unheard of for a wholly oral mind or a wholly oral situation.
Oh, interesting. Totally. Now, there's also this other part where I wanted to talk with you too about this. It seems to me that whereas literacy too, doesn't it afford something like the abstracting of the thinking of yourself independent of context, right? This kind of like thing that Descartes like does on steroids. Like if I remember right, Ong talks about like where people who are illiterate have a very difficult time talking about themselves in the abstract, right? They usually like they can talk about themselves in the context of telling a story, right? Or undergoing something or something like that. But like to ask you like, well, who are you really? Like these things that draw out, right? That didn't really become possible until literacy. Am I right?
I think that's correct. I think that's very right. There's a lot. I think David Olson has so much great stuff on this. Eric Havelock has so much great stuff. Yeah, Ong, Ivan Illich, Jack Goody. Again, there's such a Elizabeth Eisenstein. Her the printing presses and need to change. There's just so much on this. That there is a kind of hypothetical thought. So when Luria did his study with illiterate peasants in Russia, he went up there and he would say something like this. He would say to the people, he would say, so in the north where this particular person lives, there are only white bears. And they would go, okay. And he goes, okay, so you go up to the north and you see a bear. What color is it? And they would go, I don't know. I didn't see the bear. And they would go, well, what color is it? And they would be like, I don't know. There's lots of different color bears in different places. And like immediately concluded that, these were illiterate people who were somehow illogical and unable to make inferences and think rationally. And other people went, no. This has to do with genre of utterance. And like the person who was posing the question was, again, you need the meta language. The person who was posing the question was imagining that these were logical conjectures that were rigorously sound and could be, deduced the right answer from, whereas to the people who were actually hearing them, they were going, this is just hearsay. I don't have to like follow what you're claiming as some necessary truth and some logical deduction that could be entailed. You're just making nonsense, So I think, the trying to understand the genre of the utterance, that ability, I think we're so used to testing and formal schooling that we've learned to think very abstractly about information. And we look down at tests and we go, oh, look, they're asking something about information generally. Whereas the Holy Oral Mind, I don't know if it has that kind of rigorous meta language to differentiate what potentially could be going on. Instead, it just kind of goes from its own experience and is like, well, that's not my experience. So next, they don't really have that concern about how it's supposed to be understood in the abstract.
It doesn't have that horizon that is given by the possibility, of, oh, totally.
Like a smooth and right answer, again, notice, the number of words that I just used that were meta language was just weird, like even a grade. Yeah. You don't think of grade as meta language, but it's a letter that's written down.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. Because it's also this in some sense, I'm thinking about, this what actually one of my favorite videos that you did, which was the one on Facebook, right? Where you talked about, and this gets into the whole thing with mirrors, right? And this sense of, this kind of the basic fault, essentially. Like in the way you talked about it, you were making a link in that video of this experience of disconfirming language, right? Which I would imagine in something like an oral culture, like the notion of having a disconfirming language, I don't even know if it's possible, right? In that sense, right? But I imagine it's kind of because everything is so context dependent, right? And used context.
I think that's interesting. I guess there are probably greater demands for forms, just spontaneous forms of kinds of diplomacy. But in another way, I think this is, especially if you go to Ong, that the oral world is much more antagonistic. It has that, it's an agon. You have this different forces come together. One says this, one says no, one says that, and there's this contestation. Whereas the kind of cool detachment that comes from entertaining a thought without being animated by it, literacy really, really funds that. It allows, as McLuhan says, literacy made surgery possible. It makes possible this ability to act without reacting. I remember when the Flint water crisis happened here in Michigan, and there was a woman who was given testimony about what had happened to her family and her children. And she was obviously very upset. And when she got up to give her testimony, she pulled out her statement and she basically read it and was biting back tears while she was reading the statement. And in some way you could go, well, of course she's going to read a statement, but there's another sense in which like if she wouldn't have had the ability to write it down and read it, she would have started to react to her own reaction, and the whole thing would have just fell apart. And so she was able to get a hold of herself and like keep her composure amidst an obviously very emotionally riling time. And so I think in the oral societies, some of the more, I guess, difficult, I was just on this panel on phenomenology of dyslexia in Washington, D.C. about 3 weeks ago. And, it's really interesting to look at number of people who are in prison who have dyslexia. And if you enter the society and then you're taken to not read, and then you're taken to be like somebody who has like some mental deficit because you can't read or you have reading difficulties, then illiteracy rates come in. And as you get to illiteracy rates, you get to sort of different orientations to your emotions. And again, all kinds of opportunities start to fall out, and people get, they end up in the prison system. It's really, it's quite scary how much illiteracy rates run with gang memberships, run with forms of domestic violence. There's a lot of ways in which becoming literate kind of changes your overall relation to yourself, your own thoughts, your own emotional life. I think so that'll be one little thing. And maybe I don't want to rush. I don't want to push the argument around here. But I think where we were going just about 10 or 15 minutes ago with this question about the spike of loneliness or the forms of alienation. I'd like to see if we could, if time permits, I would like to make sure we get back to some of that.
Yeah, totally. And that's I think that's the thing that like I'm, especially when you talked about like this kind of oral culture is like this kind of, and antagonism, right? There's this kind of sense of contact, right? Like I would imagine articulated words, there probably were articulated words, but like just so many like, sounds and good, like animation and in everything so fused into the context of the relation, right, was housed in that like you get this sense of like another way of talking about is contact, right? This kind of sense of contact.
Yeah.
Whereas in some way, like, and as you pointed out in that video on Facebook, right, you were talking about like, well, like, you have this break, right? And you lose connection, as you said, with the kind of ongoing sensations of being a body, right? And you become these kind of break in being, break with the other, right? Where like you become an other for others, and you roll yourself back, and then like to the degree that break happened, or is how deep it is to the degree that what you start to call you is no longer over here, right? It's now all of a sudden what I think you think about me. And if you're identified with it, then your whole life is essentially about, and of course, Facebook is ripe with this, like, literacy on steroids is right with this, which is you could spend all day, right, manipulating, influencing, trying to get that kind of narcissistic being an other for others, right, because of this fault line, right, or this schism between you and the other. And in some sense, like it's even to this point now where it's so interesting because it's not just it's not just, whereas the narcissism of of that sense, but like there's like a couple levels of it where now I can have an icon of myself, right, and go out there and get its reflection that then I reflect upon, right? Like there's this removal away from vulnerability and estrangement that I think is like it's out there talking to people right now, and so at some level, like that I'll kind of come back to. And this, I don't even know. Once we get into that, I'm like, I don't even know what words to use or how to think about it exactly. But
no, I think those are great. I think that we're different people, and we're different people in different relationships with different others, and we discover a lot about ourselves depending upon the different others that we're currently in connection with. And there is a kind of homogenizing of self in making everyone substitutable or interchangeable. That is, when each person is unique to me in my relationship, and I think this is true. Like if every parent, they can have 4 or 5 kids, but they have a very different parenting relationship with each child. They might even like some more than the others. I mean, there's all this there's a lot of complexities going on there. But yeah, that sense in which we are very different people in different relationships with different others. But then when you get these kind of online, I'm going to post something on Facebook just anonymously, generally, like I increasingly have some abstract notion of myself as it is context free, as it is independent of all these particular kinds of relations. And that itself is, yeah, it's probably, it's some sign of stability, but it's another kind of radical estrangement. I mean, it's like this multi-layered thing that I think you're sort of hinting at.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't, I think that's there's probably a ton of factors there. I mean, some of it had to do with the promise of upward social mobility that happened after the Second World War, as people said goodbye to friends and family, again, for a better paying job. And Becker's essay called "The Spectrum of Loneliness" is really, illuminating a lot of this, because what he would say there is that, not only is there the problem that we're a self-aware social animal. So you have herd animals and flock animals that don't really bear self-awareness the way we do. So they probably feel loneliness, but only when they're away from the herd. We are social animals, but we also have these deep, interiority, the sense of inward representation, the sense of my own past, my own possibilities of future, and my own unique characteristics and qualities that I bring to the world. And so what that means is that I can feel lonely in a crowd. And so there's 2 kinds of loneliness. They go in different directions. One in when I feel like I'm not really had enough time with other people, but then there's other times when I haven't had enough time with myself. And so as I get older and as I incorporate more of others and more history in me, the more I can feel lonely in the crowd, and the more I start to feel something like solitude. And I say, well, I prefer to be, quotes, alone. And so again, when you were talking about these kinds of alone experiences that then are like positive feedback loops that lead more into it, I think it is something like, that's like vulnerability management becomes like a crutch that then becomes more and more, difficult to have those kind of spontaneous interactions. And when we were talking about this difference between antagonistic or these cool and detached, one of the ways to come at it is to say, what are the differences when you want to talk with someone between having a face-to-face or a phone conversation versus a texting? And I think, a lot of students, for many things, that depends on what it is, but for many things, they kind of prefer texting because they get a chance to, in a detached way, think and really carefully wordsmith what they're going to say. They sometimes feel like performance anxiety to have to come up and formulate thoughts on the fly, and they're going to say something they regret, or there's all these kinds of different ways in which you can feel the antagonistic nature of everyday speech, because it is, it has that live time interactive. Even my wife and I, we do a lot of papers and we exchange papers for feedback. But we've learned over the years to never give the feedback verbally. It gets me very irritated. It's so much easier to write it on paper and go, here's my suggestions for your revisions. But if I start and go, if I'm going to point it out verbally, piece by piece, or she's going to do it to me, we get very irritated and be like, just write it down and I'll think about it.
Right. Oh, totally. Oh, totally. Yeah. It's so interesting too, because it's like, well, just also that, just kind of going back to the pre-literate, in this way, and especially before mirrors, or which in some sense, even the sense of I did, my face, how much, I'm trying to think about how much am I, whereas we say kind of the way that I'm lonely in a crowd or in relationship now is that in some sense I'm not really relating to the other and confronting the otherness of the other and tolerating the anxiety of all of that, right? Instead, I'm already looking for a particular way that you're thinking about me, and I'm on, right? And that's the way I'm lonely. Like I'm lonely in a crowd, let's say, or I'm lonely in relationship, right? In some way. All the avoidance of vulnerability. Thereby kind of actually revealing a profound vulnerability of self. I mean, you're talking about a self who's completely vulnerable, because if you don't think the way I need you to think about me, I'm done. Right? I'm crushed in some way. But like in a pre-literate society, a relation in that sense, like like just even the sense of like, it seems like just even the sense of having a face is completely different. like it's where in some sense in the narcissistic reflection, you're always thinking about like how I look, right? Essentially my face. But I'm in some kind of like an oral culture, like my face, I've never seen it, right? In fact, it's like it seems like my face is for everyone else. It's like they paint it and all that kind of stuff, right? Like I don't even have a sense of some kind of me in the modern sense of the word that I've seen the mere image of, that then I can then kind of inform, right, my trying to get reified by you in some sense. Like
I think that's exactly right. In oral societies, other people decorate your face, and your identity is one that's part of the tribe, so it's never in question. Whereas we know of life off the rack, and so we're scared that we might not really be anyone. We have to have this generalized other that we measure up to and try to, conform to. One of the best books on this, just absolutely fascinating, is "Oh, What a Blow That Phantom Gave Me" by Edmund Carpenter, who was a colleague of McLuhan. This was like in the 1960s, late 60s, 67. He was commissioned by the government of New Guinea to go and to try to end these warring tribes that were having, vengeance, killings, and cannibalism and all kinds of crazy stuff going on in Pawpaw. And he went there and he took all these modern communication technologies, cameras and, video recorders and tape recorders and chessboards and mirrors, and sort of introduced a lot of these different tribes to these technologies. And it's, the discovery of self, the recognition of a self as a separate thing from the tribe, was, he documented it in countless ways. It was not uncommon for him to, they would take a picture and then they would show people the photo, and they didn't even know what to make of it. They're like, what is this? And then they point to the nose, and then they touch them on the nose, and like suddenly the people would have this like shock of, they just captured me, like somewhere on there. Like a different way to say all this, and maybe to echo what you were saying, is there's a group photo and you're in the group photo. Who's the first person you look at? Yourself. And it's, you know what everyone else looks like, but you don't know what you look like. And even as you're looking at the photo, you're going, but what do other people see when they see that? Kind of wondering what other people see when they see our face. And that's, I think there is a sort of like, there's a profound like discovery of who one really is there, that we are really thoroughly in relationship. We're not just this self-standing autonomous thing. I would say money and literacy. It is certainly the calendar, the clock, it's the mirror, it's lit, but money and literacy, those are the two main legs that the self-standing autonomous individual, like the notion of a person who is fully, quotes, on their own. All you need is literacy and money, and you're on your own, baby. I mean, you're making your own decisions. You're calling the shots. You're legally responsible. You're doing all this kind of stuff. But if you're failing in literacy, and it doesn't have to be highly literate, but functional literacy, you know how to sign a check, you know how to sign your name. You realize that there is this thing called an identity that is related to passports and IDs and all this other kind of stuff. And then money. I mean, I think many people realize it, that until they're flitting their own bills, they don't really feel like they're fully deliberative agents in the same way.
Right, totally. Yeah. So I would imagine identity in an oral culture would be would be, well, I mean, I guess it's the way that, I mean, John talked about, I heard John talking about this who was a cognitive scientist who was talking about this sense of agency, um, and identity and things of that, like that. He's like, yeah, we have we kind of have this weird notion of like, especially like in extreme form right now of like, like the extreme version of like identity politics and stuff like that, which is like this kind of notion of identity is this thing that you have, right? Like, and you make decisions about, right? And you decide on. And John was saying from, a 4E cognitive science, which of course is influenced by Dreyfus and Heidegger and all that stuff, right? Where he's like, no, you have agency such that you become an identity, such that you become identifiable by others. You develop character, right? Such that you can, it's in some sense so that you're perceivable by other characters, right? There's kind of this notion that it's like, it's not just subjective and it's not just intersubjective, right? It's kind of transjective in some sense, right? And it sounds like in holy or culture, that sense of like my character, my agency, who I am, in some sense is like is in some senses for you, right?
Thoroughly,
Without the
it's thoroughly collectivist.
yeah,
Who's
yeah,
the tribe is the self,
yeah, yeah,
It's even things like arranged marriages. I mean, arranged marriages, I think they were probably, the only conceivable way to do such things for the longest time. This kind of romantic individualism where you go out and fall in love and get married and do the happily ever. That's so modern. It's
yeah,
very all this kind of modern individualism.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, totally, totally. And so
The
that,
family,
yeah,
the merging of families, and the sense of doing what is good for the collective. I mean, it was caught within seasonal rhythms, and the world made calls upon you in a way that we've learned how to detach ourselves from particular geographies, from particular rhythms of the day and the year, and people really do have a kind of radically technologically created individual autonomy of again going about their day and deciding which restaurant to go to have cook their meal, all this kind of stuff. It's hard to put it in adequate perspective. I think
right.
this is one of the way, I've been doing a lot of stuff on superabundance lately, and I'm going to have this piece coming out very soon on superabundance. And
Oh, cool.
if you try to think about like what's happened over the last 150 years, it's really interesting. People say this all the time. They say, well, this is going to be the first generation that they don't have it better than the previous generation. And they're all this concern about young people not wanting to work and all this kind of stuff. And in some way, by home ownership, clearly, point well taken, there is a real home ownership problem for young people. And there's job wages and all this kind of inequality. But if you look at the eases and comforts and convenience and sort of overall benefits to just be around today, young people, they live almost like gods compared to people in previous generations. They have climate control environments, they have super entertainment systems, they have Spotify and they're gaming and all this, all their friends are online. And so even though there is like loneliness epidemic and suicide spike among female teens, the age of ease and comfort and convenience is just unparalleled.
Right.
So this could be, I want to go back to this issue that we were talking about with the AI stuff, right? It's that when electricity hit, and it was right around 150 years ago, a little bit, somewhere around there. When electricity first hit, the Lamplighters Guild got together and went, "Oh, we're all going to lose our jobs. This stuff is Satan. This is bad. It's evil. It's got the devil." And they said literally, this is going to bring joblessness, and we're all going to miss fire, and all this stuff's going to be bad. And what they weren't realizing, again, that a lot of people did lose their jobs. It was true. But what they weren't processing was that at that moment, within the next 50 to 100 years, there was going to be a proliferation of endless electric gadgets that you plug in that perform every possible task. I think we're sort of at the moment right now with AI. And in the same way that there was a pre-electric world and a post-electric world, and many of us cannot imagine going back to the world pre-electricity, there's soon enough, and it's going to happen like that. It's going to happen in 5-10 years where people are going to not be able to imagine what life was like before AI. It's going to be that sweeping, and it's going to be that many, every little thing now done by AI, the way that right now there's all kinds of things that you plug in and electric gadgets that used to do manual labor.
Yeah. And do you think it'll be that way where it is so much of it is just going to become so transparent so quickly that in some sense, like we're going to kind of retrospectively realize it, in some way, right?
Yeah, the people are being transformed as the culture is changing. So the people themselves are being made over in the image of these AIs. They feed us in certain ways, and our appetites grow out of the way that they feed us.
Yeah, yeah. God, it just has me think about this sense of like that sense of the removal of friction and this kind of everything coming so instant clear, like and now higher level of like intelligibility just being right here, right? Like all of that. Now I don't think it's so. I would imagine that's going to then introduce new frictions that then we have to overcome and all that kind of stuff. But that sense of just that sense of the way I love the way that and I love the way, and I don't know where this is all going in terms of relationship, right? I have a feeling at some point we're going to have to reckon with, now that we're going to have a generation that like doesn't have a memory before the internet and raised on screens and just the physical aspect of that, like we're going to find out, we're going to be finding out what that grand experiment was, right? Like, and and may have to come to reckoning with it, but like, in some sense, this thing about relation and kind of the breakdown of embodied relation, the back and forth. So there's the quantitative aspect, the stuff that you can measure, right? Which is like the amount of time we're spending and the number of friends that we have and all that kind of stuff. Whereas life just at one point just required so much relation in functioning that like in some sense your nervous system, got articulated with it. Now that that's gone, right? You have these NSAIDs. You know what an NSAID is? That whole notion of like these guys, all of that. But then there's there's the way that, in contrast, when you think about this, is I love the way Family Systems talks about this, right? About intimacy being this really interesting, like events or moments of intimacy with somebody else. They talk about has to do with basically the way they conceptualize it. And I think this is really right. Like these two fundamental existential drives, the drive for closeness and the drive for agency and autonomy. And that, and so moments of intimacy are where you're in relationship with somebody, right? And at first, get a relationship or whatever, and at first it's like all that's met, right? Like no problem. And then at some point I start to want something that all of a sudden I look over there and I'm like, wait, if I'm really honest about that, I may lose you. Shit. So I won't be honest about that, right? But wait a minute. But then I've just lost me. Well, no, then I'll be honest about, but then I'll lose you. And you end up in these dialectics, right? These contradictions of these two, some of the deepest drives that we have, belonging and autonomy, right? In some sense. And so they talk about moments of intimacy are these developmental thresholds, and they can be very, very transformative and self-producing, right? And that the because essentially if you're not going to have a real relationship, you're going to have to say it, right? And the other is going to need to turn towards you in that, right? And usually what ends up happening is when you finally say it, the thing that you were most afraid of wasn't even relevant, and it opens up a new world for the other, and like all of the world of that you didn't know opens up, that can be very, very like deepening, right? And in so many respects, right? For
Yeah.
closeness. And what they said, what was really interesting is they said that all of that is a function of the ability to tolerate anxiety.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If we can't tolerate anxiety, we can't say it, right? And we can't turn towards somebody else like saying it, right? It's that tolerating of anxiety. And then they have these ways of saying, like, there's these three main ways that we don't tolerate anxiety, or unless we move away from intimacy, which is like, one is dissociation, the other one is just submitting, right? We'll just do what you want to do. And the other one is dominating, right? Like, I just take over and then eliminate what you want. Or they talk about tolerate the anxiety and turn towards the other, and then things kind of open up.
Yeah. I just watched, I don't know if you ever follow this, and I'm here, I'm giving promotions for more YouTubes, but Dear Diary of a CEO, which I've seen some good and some bad videos, but he just had Esther Perel on, and it was actually a very good interview. I think she gives a lot of very good relationship advice. But yeah, I think, Joseph Campbell has the line that he says, lovers must love many things together, not merely each other. And so I think some of that, when Perel was talking about it, she was saying, couples who have been together a long time, they need to explore new things together, not just being the same old thing. And so that exploring new things together is part of that way that I think you manage that twin demand for something like belonging, but also autonomous energy. And I mean, I think that's also very right that, if you go to like friendship and try to look at like the friendship literature, that's probably one of the main dynamics of friendship. Now, there are other ones, of course, but that really is this main, and it is a dialectical tension that you need a freedom to be independent, but a freedom to be dependent. And if you go in any, either direction full bore, you end up violating the other demand. And so we are kind of in that space of being able to go, hey, look, I can't hang out with you. I got my own things I need to do, but also I need to be able to go, hey, I need you to take me to the hospital. Or I need somebody to come and get me from the airport. Or, there are ways in which we do have to lay a claim on others to go, I'm needy right now and you need to be there for me. But I also, we need to go, hey, look, I can't be with you right now. I got to do my own thing. And, we have that. We manage it differently with different friends for different reasons. Every friendship manages that tension a little bit uniquely.
Yeah. And it seems like that tension, like, is this, I think it's how we become people, right? I think how we become a person in some sense, right?
Yeah.
And so just the removal of that friction, so strange to think about. It's just so strange to think about in a big way.
I do think that the frictionless society is it's very toxic. People need a way to grow. I think that's one of the things that's going to happen. That's a different way to go back to the AI stuff, is that once AIs can do everything, so they can do it all at the push of a button, there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff they still can't do. Like, it can give you advice on how to exercise. It's not going to do the sit-up for you. It can tell you how to eat and what's the recommended diet, but it's not going to chew your food, metabolize it for you. It can give you advice on how to learn to play the guitar, but it's not going to like manually make you a guitarist. Now, you might turn to it to play music, but if you want to grow yourself, there's going to be nothing left to do but just grow yourself. That's going to be the last horizon. And so I could see a spike in non-digital forms, everything from dancing and sculpting to juggling, playing musical instruments, to pub culture, where people are much more interested in having conversations. There's just a whole bunch of ways in which, once the AIs have achieved all of this, now like a whole new horizon of, well, what am I going to do with all this other time that I have, and well, there's going to be nothing to do. Now, maybe somebody's going to say, well, you're going to have these kind of new super sophisticated AI generated video games that are partly a movie and partly AR and they're partly VR and it's all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, it's going to be a porno and it's going to be a movie. That's going to be a video game. And, it's going to be reading biometrics and watching your eye dilation. It's going to be playing you. I don't know. I personally would be very cautious of playing a quantum computer AI generated video game, but I'm sure there's some people who are going to go, wow, this is the greatest thing since the fire.
Totally. Now, just that sense, I'm just curious your thoughts about just, I mean, there's the whole AI, which is still like AI for the most part is very specific, right? Pretty context dependent, right? In some sense. There's general AI, right? Like being able to do, in some sense have this kind of agency, right? In multiple contexts of things, being able to learn, right? But I can still imagine like there being kind of a general AI and it's still not having any kind of like conscience or sentience in the sense that we're thinking about it. Like this, one of the things that's interesting just to think about is like, when I think about this, I just don't even know how it could be super anticlimactic. Who the hell knows? But like, how is it that we would, like, what would that do if all of a sudden we got, right, like the lights turned on over there, like, because there's all the ways to where it is now, which is like it's deeply intelligent in particular contexts, in particular domains, and there's still this sense of I'm not really having to like deal with another agent, when I'm dealing with these things, right, in some core way. Have you thought much about that aspect of it when if the lights ever turn on?
I would take a couple steps. I mean, I guess the first thing that I would say is that I don't think my liver is conscious. I don't think that my immune system is conscious, but I think they're both incredibly complicated systems that do an amazing amount of work, and they possess kinds of intelligibility that make them very functional and very powerful. And so I'm not sure that I would want to be persuaded that something would have to be, quotes, conscious in order to be amazingly powerful and revolutionary. So, I mean, that would be the first. As far as could something in principle, could there be a kind of consciousness that emerges out of complex interplay of other things? I guess I see no reason to just rule it out, other than like religious dogma. I don't think there's any reason to just rule it out as a possibility. I mean, it may be potentially possible. Somebody else might go, no, unless it's alive, it's just never going to have consciousness as we know it. I don't. Yeah, again, my own sense is more of how much people themselves are going to be transformed in their consciousness as they use these technologies. I guess I'll not skirt your question. I mean, I think we are going to have to deal with something like, this alien intelligence and what is it? How will it experience itself? I don't know. See, this is where the oral stuff comes back with a vengeance, right? So if you remember back when Watson supposedly bested the Jeopardy champs, this was a while back. Yeah. There was their mainframe. Watson wasn't plugged into the internet, but they were saying that Watson was using natural language. That's such a funny expression because Watson wasn't born orally. Watson didn't face the threat of potentially being illiterate. That is, it was a fully chirographically controlled language from the very bottom up. And that's true of all AIs. They're text-based. They're not really just audio, like they're not based in acoustical differences. Now you might say, well, yeah, they can have, speech to text. And then they're just automating that. Well, I know, but that's because it's already with the literate framework that's in place. But I'm not sure that I would say that it has natural language. So in some way, they're already going to be very, very different than anything that we would recognize as, quotes, a mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah,
Oh,
totally.
yeah. No person is literate from the ground up.
Right. Right. Yeah. It just strikes me that like what it's hard for me to imagine. Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine. I suppose if there was some way that like it's hard for me to imagine it having at least consciousness that we would recognize as something like ours without in some sense um yeah, because all there's a certain kind of enclosure of all of this, even if it's enclosed just within the internet. There's still we're working on information that it can compute and all that kind of stuff. And I just don't think consciousness is computational. But like if in some sense it's like if in some sense it could somehow, and I don't know how you would do this. I don't even I if I know how we do this. Like in some sense, if there was some way that it could be self-related to the domain of unknown unknowns, right? Like without making it a known, like in that way that seems so essential to us, right? And I don't know how it could do that, but if it could do that, I could imagine it. I could imagine it starting to like tap into something like sentience, right? In the way that we're talking about it.
I think again, we're going. You got to go back to if we're going to go to Heidegger. I mean, Heidegger, I think, is very rich here because he would say something like, you're going to have to deal with this problem of time. And so let's just say, for argument's sake, that they invent some quantum computer AI that has 10,000 times the processing speed of any AI today, or whatever, 100,000 times of what a human can do, whatever it is, no matter what the limit is. Well, how will that affect their experience of the passage of time? Will they be bored? Will they not? So let's take problems of infinity. Okay, so if I say, for example, that, and I think this is true, there is no highest prime number. There is no highest prime number. And we can always have a computer working on discovering the next discoverable, next highest prime number. But now, because there is no highest prime number, all the speed in the world doesn't get you anywhere other than going nowhere fast. It is you're
Yeah,
increasing
yeah,
to approximate at a certain point. The telling us what the latest highest prime number is probably going to take longer than it would to achieve the next highest prime number. The whole thing, but it never gets to the highest prime number. So I mean,
right.
in that sense, it would seem like it's going to be fated with existential dread and boredom that we couldn't imagine.
Yeah, totally, totally. Yeah.
There's so many utility in it all. It's like
Come on, just shoot it. Kill it, man. Yeah.
people really do believe they're going to give way to or give birth to something that's 100,000 times as smart, 10,000 times as smart as we are. I mean, they're obviously monsters if they haven't thought about like the psychological and the existential dynamics that would be involved in such a consciousness.
Oh God, yeah. God. Oh my God. Yeah, totally. Totally. Hey, it's really good talking with you. I have to get going. It's been so great catching up with you. I
Yeah,
really
yeah.
appreciate you
I
filling
appreciate
all this
the
out
invite.
with me.
I'm happy to do it more. Let's let me know.
Right on. All right, my friend. Take care.
What stocking is truly stuffed without a copy of a candy?
Right on.
Copy. Come on, fulfill someone's wish list. It's fun stuff. I, I
Talk
have
to
to,
you soon. Bye.
well, you